The Philistines gathered all their forces at Aphek, and Israel camped by the spring in Jezreel. Now they had been assembling earlier. So before we go any further, this whole section here, really, from 27 on down, we're talking about like a bunch of different things at once. We're setting up this huge fight that's going to happen. It's going to happen in 1 Samuel 31, the end of the book of 1 Samuel. And we're setting up the various pieces that are going to go into this. We're talking about David and why he's not going to be there. We're talking about Saul and what's going to happen to him when he's there. Okay, so all of these stories here in these couple of chapters are kind of happening somewhat simultaneously. While Saul, these forces are assembling, then they set camp, and then they kind of move around, and then David is going to be told to leave, and then Saul's going and consulting this ghost, and David's going to go back to his town and have a crisis of his own to deal with. And it's all kind of happening simultaneously. So these chapters are not necessarily all in sequential order because they're kind of explaining different aspects of this battle that are happening somewhat simultaneously here. So, while Saul, or even before Saul, going to see the Witch of Endor and Samuel's ghost, this is happening. The Philistines gathered all their forces at Aphek, and Israel camped by the spring in Jezreel. As the Philistine rulers marched with their units of hundreds and units of thousands, David and his men were marching at the rear of Achish. The commanders of the Philistines asked, "What about these Hebrews?" Achish replied, "Is this not David, who was an officer of Saul, king of Israel? He has already been with me for over a year, and from the day he left Saul until now, I have found no fault in him." But the Philistine commanders were angry with him. Remember, he's not the only king of the Philistines. The Philistines have 5 separate cities, and each of those cities have their own king and commander. So he's just one of 5, and they're all together here at this battle. Okay, so there's going to be 4 guys here who don't want David around, and 1 guy who does. So the 4 are going to outvote the 1. But the Philistine commanders were angry with him and said, "Send the man back, that he may return to the place you assigned him. He must not go with us into battle, or he will turn against us during the fighting. How better could he regain his master's favor than by taking the heads of our own men? Isn't this the David they sing about in their dances? Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands." Remember, we're the thousands here, people. They're the slayers, we're the ones they're slaying. We don't want him around. So Achish called David and said to him, "As surely as the Lord lives," he's using the all capital letters, Lord, that's Jehovah, "you have been reliable, and I would be pleased to have you serve with me in the army." So he's using David's own God's name as part of this statement here. "From the day you came to me until now, I have found no fault in you, but the rulers don't approve of you. Turn back and go in peace. Do nothing to displease the Philistine rulers." "But what have I done?" asked David. "What have you found against your servant from the day I came to you until now? Why can't I go and fight against the enemies of my lord the king?" Achish answered, "I know that you have been as pleasing in my eyes as an angel of God. Nevertheless, the Philistine commanders have said he must not go up with us into battle. Now get up early, along with your master's servants who have come with you," his men in other words, "and leave in the morning as soon as it is light." So David and his men got up early in the morning to go back to the land of the Philistines, and the Philistines went up to Jezreel. Now, this is happening before the previous story with the witch, because the ghost of Samuel told Saul that next day he's going to die, and his sons are going to die. Okay, that happens in chapter 31. But this is before that, because David is leaving the battle before the battle starts. So like I said, these stories are kind of all happening somewhat simultaneously to explain different aspects of this upcoming big Israel versus Philistine fight. But David has something else to deal with. Now, first of all, David is being removed from a situation in which it's going to be pretty difficult. He is going to end up having to either fight his own men, his own countrymen, the Israelites, or betray Achish. One of these two things is going to have to happen. Maybe even both. He might end up fighting his own men and then turning against Achish later on. We don't know what he would have done. I mean, God removed him, but, this is one of those things where God providentially removed David from the situation so that this situation never had to get to this point. I don't know what David would have done. I don't know if David would have known what he would have done. He doesn't really indicate one way or another here what he was going to do. Apparently he was going to be loyal to Achish. Apparently he was going to be. He was even kind of protesting his innocence here when Achish was sending him away. So apparently he was planning on being loyal to Achish. But that didn't mean he was going to have to fight his own countrymen, the Hebrews. So I don't know if he would have gone all the way through with that or not. I'm not sure if David knew if he was going to go all the way through with that or not. And we'll never know if he was going to go all the way through with that or not, because in the end he didn't have to. In the end, the circumstances played out in such a way that he was removed from the situation before it ever got to that point. It never says that God did it. In that chapter, the Philistines themselves don't say that they're motivated to do this because of God, but I do believe this is one of those instances where God providentially arranged these things to remove David from the circumstance so that it never had to come to that. But anyway, David is going to have a problem of his own to deal with here when he goes back to his adopted town now of Ziklag. David and his men reached Ziklag on the third day. So they've left the battle camp, and the Philistines are going to go up and march on Israel, and David and his men are going back to Ziklag. Now the Amalekites had raided the Negev and Ziklag. So while they were gone, I don't know how long they were gone for. Apparently it takes them 3 days to go from Ziklag to Aphek and back, and then in a one-way trip. So they must have been gone for at least a week-ish, because they had to go to Aphek in the first place and then come back. But I don't know how long it had been since he left Ziklag. A week. At least a week, apparently. Maybe longer than that. I don't know. Depends on where he was before this all started. I'm not sure. But while he was gone, he and his fighting men were gone. His vulnerable ones, his women and children, were attacked in their absence. Now the Amalekites had raided the Negev and Ziklag. They had attacked Ziklag and burned it, and had taken captive the women and all who were in it, both young and old. They killed none of them, but carried them off as they went on. They kidnapped them, in other words. The Amalekites apparently have a habit of attacking people from the behind. They did that to the Israelites when they first came out of Egypt. That's what made God so mad at them. And they're doing it here again, too. When David and his men are gone, they're swooping in to attack the women, children, and the old people after David has left. They didn't kill them, though. They didn't kill them. They probably need them to help replenish their own population, because David is wiping them out. So they probably kept the women and children alive in order to incorporate them into their own tribe, so that they're not completely wiped out, like God wants them to be, like God has told the Israelites to do. So when David and his men came to Ziklag, they found it destroyed by fire, and their wives and sons and daughters taken captive. Now, I don't know how they would have known that their women and children had been kidnapped instead of killed. I guess because their bodies weren't on the ground. Maybe they, if the place itself was burned. And I guess if the people in the town who were there when the attack happened had been killed, their bodies would still be lying around, and since they're not, David and his men are concluding that they were kidnapped instead. I don't know what the deal is with these cats. So David and his men wept aloud until they had no strength left to weep. They don't know what happened. One way or another, they don't know what happened. They might they might assume that their wives are still alive and their kids are still alive because they're not seeing their bodies anywhere. But they still don't know what happened. There's no survivors, no one around to tell them what happened. So even though their loved ones may not be dead, they don't know where they are. So David and his men wept aloud until they had no strength left to weep. David's 2 wives had been captured, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail, the widow of Nabal of Carmel. David was greatly distressed because the men were talking of stoning him. Each was bitter in spirit because of his sons and daughters. But David found strength in the Lord his God. So they were getting so messed up here, they were about to have a mutiny on their hands. Now, it's possible that not all of them were crazy about the idea of selling their services to the Philistines in the first place. And he has 600 guys here that he's got traveling around with them. And their families, obviously, are with them too. They may not all have been on board with this plan of working for the Philistines in the first place. And so, who knows? I mean, there may have been some grumbling going on for a while, but now the situation is pretty bad. Then David said to Abiathar the priest, the son of Ahimelech, "Bring me the ephod." Abiathar brought it to him, and David inquired of the Lord. Now remember, the ephod is where they kept the and the Thummim. So when he says, "Bring me the ephod," he means bring me the and the Thummim, because those are inside pockets in the ephod. So David is talking to the and the Thummim here. So when it says, "Inquire to the Lord," he's not having a mouth-to-mouth or verbal conversation with God. All right. It's written that way, and we have in our English Bibles the quotation marks and all the standard, punctuation and formatting about a conversation. But David is not actually having a verbal conversation with God here. He is consulting the and the Thummim for advice. He's asking questions about the and the Thummim, and these are simple yes, no, either or questions. And then the and the Thummim are lighting up somehow, however that worked. And he's getting his answer that way. But he's not speaking to a prophet. Okay, Abiathar is a priest, but not a prophet. So there's no prophet here to speak the word of the Lord directly to David. And David does not have the same face-to-face relationship with God that Moses did. Because there was a big deal about God speaking to Moses face-to-face. He doesn't do that with David. So David is not having a conversation here with God. It's not like they're actually speaking to each other back and forth. He is asking questions of the and the Thummim, and based on the way the and the Thummim are lighting up or somehow, he's getting his answers. So the writer of this material, sometime later, whoever that would have been, Gad or Nathan or some other prophet down the line, is writing this like a conversation. And again, they're not using punctuation and quotation marks like we do with our English formatting. So, and it's being written as David is asking his questions and getting this information, that he's not actually speaking to God here, like it seems like when you just let your eyes roll over the text. Anyway, so he's asking, shall I pursue this raiding party, whoever they are? Will I overtake them? Pursue them, he answered. So basically one of the stones was lighting up, yes. You will certainly overtake them and succeed in the rescue. Again, God's not actually talking to David here. He's lighting up these stones in response to David's questions and getting David the answers he wants. And this is the information that David gets out of that. David and the 600 men with him came to the Besor ravine, where some stayed behind. For 200 men, there's 600 total, so this is 200 of those 600, were too exhausted to cross the ravine. But David and 400 men continued the pursuit. Remember, these guys who have had a rough time of it. They went all the way up to the battle with the Philistines, expecting to fight their own countrymen. They got sent back. Then they found their village destroyed and their women and children missing. And now they're pursuing the raiding party. Some of it's going to take a toll on people. And some of these people have had too much taken out of them. They found an Egyptian in a field and brought him to David. They gave him water to drink and food to eat. part of a cake of pressed figs, and 2 cakes of raisins. He ate and was revived, for he had not eaten any food or drunk any water for 3 days and 3 nights. You can go without eating for a few days, but you can't go without drinking for very long. So this guy would have been near the end of his rope at this time. So David asked him, "To whom do you belong, and from where do you come?" He said, "I am an Egyptian." We haven't read about Egypt in a long time. This is our first reference to Egypt since they left, way back in the middle of the book of Exodus. They left Egypt, the Pharaoh drowned in the Red Sea, and basically, in all this time in the between, we haven't heard a peep out of Egypt. And now we're finally hearing about Egypt again. There is an Egyptian slave wandering in the south Judean desert, whose master was an Amalekite. I am an Egyptian, the slave. I mean, remember, as I said back when we went over the Exodus and the stuff about Egypt, I believe that our timeline for Egyptian history is wrong. And I believe that it was I believe that the Exodus happened in 1446 BC, and after that is when Egypt fell to outside forces. The Amalekites from the east, the northeast, the Asian peoples. I believe as Israel was moving out, of course, they got attacked by the Amalekites. I don't know if the Amalekites were on their way into Egypt already at that time, or if they just happened to be in the area and took advantage. And I don't know how much longer after that it took for the Amalekites to move all the way into Egypt. But I believe that after the fall of Egypt, from the Exodus and the Red Sea crossing, at some point after that, the Amalekites moved in and conquered Egypt and became the ruling foreign dynasty known as the Hyksos, known to the Egyptians as the Hyksos, the shepherd kings. And I believe that's basically what Egypt has been dealing with since then. I believe that our timeline of Egyptian history is incorrect, and that the foreign rule, everybody acknowledges that there was foreign rule of Egypt for a period of time. Typically, you'll see this listed as happening a few centuries earlier. But I believe it's because we have our Egyptian history incorrect. And I believe that it was during that time, from the Exodus until now, that Egypt was ruled by the Amalekites. I think this is actually kind of a hint at that. Here we have an Egyptian who is identifying himself as a slave of an Amalekite, who is a member of a wandering raiding party somewhere in the South Judean wilderness. So I believe this is kind of a clue that Egypt there are still a lot of Egyptians who are slaves of Amalekites at this point in time. So he said, "I am an Egyptian, the slave of an Amalekite. My master abandoned me when I became ill 3 days ago. We raided the Negev of the Kerethites, and the territory belonging to Judah, and the Negev of Caleb." Remember Caleb? He was a Judahite from Joshua's day. And we burned Ziklag. So he was responsible for this. Well, not really. His master was. He was just there because he was a slave. David asked him, "Can you lead me down to this raiding party?" He answered, "Swear to me before God that you will not kill me or hand me over to my master, and I will take you down to them." He led David down. So I guess David swore to him. Because the next thing it says is he led David down. So I presume we have to assume then that David did swear to him. And there they were, scattered over the countryside, eating, drinking, and reveling, because of the great amount of plunder they had taken from the land of the Philistines and from Judah. So it wasn't just Ziklag they were after. I guess what probably happened is that while the Philistines were getting ready for this big upcoming battle with Israel, and their attention was focused on marshaling their forces and moving north, the Amalekites, who probably were based more to the south, in the area between Judah and Egypt, they probably came up and raided some of these towns that were left behind as the Philistines got their forces ready and went north to fight Saul. So they had quite a bounty here, quite a booty. Eating, drinking, and reveling because of the great amount of plunder they had taken from the land of the Philistines and from Judah. David fought them from dusk until the evening of the next day. So it took a full day to wipe them all out. And none of them got away, except 400 young men who rode off in camels and fled. David recovered everything the Amalekites had taken, including his 2 wives. Nothing was missing, young or old, boy or girl, plunder or anything else they had taken. So they took it all whole. The Amalekites did not destroy this stuff. They wanted to use it. They were not interested in killing for the sake of killing at this point. They wanted this stuff because they wanted to use it. It had value to them. David brought everything back. He took all the flocks and herds, and his men drove them ahead of the other livestock, saying, "This is David's plunder." Then David came to the 200 men who had been too exhausted to follow him, and who were left behind to the Besor ravine. They came out to meet David and the people with him. As David and his men approached, he greeted them. But all the evil men and troublemakers, the sons of Belial, in other words, Belial means worthlessness. So these are the sons of worthlessness, among David's followers, said, because they did not, I don't know if they were always worthless. Okay, it's like, I don't know. Just because we're calling them sons of worthlessness here, they may not have necessarily always been sons of worthlessness. But in this case, they're acting best. Kind of like when Jesus tells Peter, "Get behind me, Satan." Peter was not always a Satan to Jesus. Satan means adversary. It means an enemy. Peter was not always an adversary to Jesus. He was not always a Satan to Jesus. But in that moment, he was. These guys may not always have been sons of Belial or sons of worthlessness. But in this moment, they were acting that way. But all the evil men and troublemakers among David's followers said, because they did not go out with us, we will not share with them the plunder we recovered. However, each man may take his wife and children and go. Now, they had a lot of plunder here, because these Amalekites didn't just raid Ziklag. They had raided a bunch of towns in Judah and in the Philistine area. So there's a lot more here. So David and his men are getting a lot more even than they sought out to get. All David wanted to do was get his wives and his men's wives and kids and their stuff back. Okay? But they're going to get that and a whole lot more because these Amalekites had done a lot more than just attack Ziklag. So now they're going to divide up the plunder. And these guys don't want those 200 layabouts to get any of it. They can have their own stuff back. They can have their women and their children back. But the rest of the plunder is ours. But David replied, no, my brothers. You must not do that with what the Lord has given us. He has protected us and handed over to us the forces that came against us. Who will listen to what you say? The share of the man who stayed with the supplies is to be the same as that of him who went down to the battle. All will share alike. David made this a statute and ordinance for Israel from that day to this. When David arrived, now apparently they're not burning any of this up to God. So they are not putting any of this stuff under the ban to be offered up to God as fire. Okay? So David does not see this then as a holy war. He does not see this as something that he needs to take all this plunder and burn it up to God. Now, obviously, again, this was originally a rescue mission. So he's not going to take his own wives and burn them up to God. So maybe because of that, then the whole thing does not be. I don't know. Normally, you would have a holy war rule where everything that you get in the war you have to burn up to God. It's under the ban, and you can't keep it for yourself. So you have to burn it up unto God, including the people or the things. But they're not doing this in this case, and God is not criticizing. Saul had this very problem back in 1 Samuel 15. It was actually the dividing line between his last straw for God to abandon him as king, is that he did not destroy all the Amalekites completely and their stuff up to God and destroy it all. And God was the thing that God got after him for. Now, God specifically told Saul to do that in that case, and this is not the same, so the rules, this is not apparently a holy war. Because David is not acting as though it was originally a rescue mission. And David is not acting like it's a holy war. No one seems to be following the rules of holy war. They're taking the plunder for themselves gleefully and gladly and happily, and they're not even thinking about burning it up to God. So apparently this is not a holy war. When David arrived in Ziklag, he sent some of the plunder to the elders of Judah, who were his friends, saying, "Here is a present for you from the plunder of the Lord's enemies." So he's definitely not putting this stuff under the ban and burning it up unto God. He's actively using it to curry political favor with some of the influential men of Judah. He sent it to those who were in Bethel, Ramoth Negev, and Jatir, to those in Aror, Sephamoth, Eshtemoa, and Rakal, to those in the towns of the Jeremielites and the Kenites, to those in, we've read about those Kenites before. They were kind of a mixed race of, Moses' father-in-law who had settled with Israel and kind of gone down from there. To those in Hormah, Bor-Ashan, Athok, and Hebron, and to those in all the other places where David and his men had roamed. That's good enough, I'd say, for now. So he is earning favor with the people of Judah, basically by buying their loyalty. Okay, so that will be basically like David's last act, or as a non-king. While this is happening, by the way, again, the timeline is a little bit hard to make out, but this is happening simultaneously with the big battle going on between Israel and Philistia. So while David is preoccupied with Ziklag and saving his wives and his men's wives and children and all that, there is a war going on between Israel and Philistia, which Israel loses, and in which Saul and his sons, including Jonathan, die. So that's happening while David is preoccupied with this. And so we're going to go back to that in the next story, which is the end of 1 Samuel, and we're going to continue on from there. And we're going to read about the end of Saul and the fall of Israel to Philistia, and then David now has to assume the role of king. And so this is essentially David's last act before he becomes really the king. He's been the king in waiting. He's been the Nagiv. I think the Hebrew word is Nagiv. The king in waiting now for some time. But after this, he's going to be the actual king. Because while he's doing this, the actual still reigning king, the guy that is still making executive decisions for Israel, and the Israelites are still listening to and looking to make these executive decisions, that guy is going to die. In fact, that guy's probably already dead at this point. While David was off doing all this stuff about Ziklag, that battle is happening and Saul is dead. So there's a vacuum of leadership, and now David's going to have to step in and be the king. So that's pretty much the transition we're going to make here, starting in the next. Remember, there is no real break between 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel. We have it divided up according to just for easier formatting in our copies, but the actual book is one long thing. So there really isn't a break between 1 Samuel 31 and 2 Samuel 1. It's all one long document.